Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, no partnership, no negotiation. On the first anniversary of the military coup that derailed Sudan's transition to civilian rule, another protester is killed and thousands take to the streets again to protest against the power grab. Also, key peace talks open in South Africa between Ethiopia's federal government and Tigrayan rebels from the country's north. 2 years of devastating conflict have triggered deepening humanitarian crises and international calls for a negotiated end to the bloodshed. And part of the world's largest telescope is hosted by South Africa. SCAR is trained on the skies to unravel some of the universe's deepest mysteries, but also plays an important part in establishing the continent's place in astronomical exploration. But first, Sudanese medics say that at least one person was killed during protests on the first anniversary of a military takeover. Tens of thousands of people were on the streets of Khartoum and other cities on Tuesday to reject Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan's overthrow of the civilian leaders he'd meant to rule alongside following the 2019 overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir. Now, pro-democracy demonstrations have been held almost weekly over the last year. Critics of the regime say that they are determined to rein in the military.
This is the first time in history we have seen a man lead a coup and not make any progress in a whole year, despite the support of foreign countries. But the Sudanese people are determined, and especially this generation that has decided to do away with military coups forever.
On the
first anniversary of the coup, we took to the streets to keep our promise to the martyrs. We reiterated that we refuse military coups as a matter of principle and that we refuse the presence of the military in our political life.
Well, security forces were out in force on Tuesday. At least 119 people have been killed in crackdowns since the coup, but protesters continue to demand a return to civilian rule.
1 year on, the Sudanese people continue to protest, denouncing the coup of Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. Over the last year, pro-democracy activists have been risking their lives. So far, at least 119 people have been killed in crackdowns on protests, with over 1,000 detained.
We don't want political compromise or partnership with the army or negotiation. And we don't want a political solution. We're not here to discuss the coup. We want to overthrow it. And we are ready to pay the price, even with our lives.
On the 25th of October 2021, the head of the army, General al-Burhan, arrested the civilian leaders he had agreed to share power with 2 years earlier. As well as facing political and social turmoil, the country is experiencing an unprecedented economic crisis. The price of food has risen by 137% in a year, and more than 1 in 3 people are struggling to find enough to eat.
The Sudanese people are starving. They cannot accept any of this. Everybody will demonstrate. The regime of the butcher al-Burhan and the security forces will fall without a doubt.
1 year after the military coup, Sudan is still mired in uncertainty. Elections have been promised for the summer of 2023, but many doubt that they will take place.
Well, Ugandan authorities are launching a full investigation and have cordoned off a school for the blind as a crime scene after 11 people were killed there in a fire. The blaze tore through the dormitories of the Salama School for the Blind in Mukono early on Tuesday. Most of the students there were sleeping at the time and were then trapped inside by burglar-proof windows. A few children did manage to escape, but devastated parents are still waiting for the identity of all of the victims to be established. Peace talks to end Ethiopia's devastating Tigray conflict began in Pretoria in South Africa on Tuesday. The negotiations are being mediated by the African Union and follow a recent fierce surging clashes between federal forces and their allies and fighters from the northern region of Tigray. Caroline Lamboulé tells us more.
It's thought to be the deadliest war being waged in the world today, but it's taking place far from the international gaze. The region of Tigray is largely cut off by a communications blackout. In South Africa, where the talks are taking place, the African Union is now attempting to broker a peace deal.
South Africa wishes the facilitation team well and hopes the talks will proceed constructively and result in a successful outcome that leads to lasting peace for all the people of our dear sister country, Ethiopia.
Several prominent African politicians, including former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, are facilitating the talks. Washington is also involved. On Sunday, U.S. Special Envoy Mike Hammer picked up the Tigray delegation in a U.S. military aircraft.
Cessation of hostilities.
Despite the arduous task ahead, some analysts are hopeful.
It is important in part because the mediators have managed to get both parties to a negotiating table. To the extent that they've been able to get to that agreement is important. And it's likely then that we may perhaps see a ceasefire in the coming days.
The talks come amid reports of significant gains over the past week by Ethiopian forces and their allies. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed first sent troops to Tigray in November 2020, after what he said were attacks by the Tigray People's Liberation Front on federal army camps. The front had dominated Ethiopian politics for years, but it was sidelined when Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018. The UN Secretary General warned last week that fighting was spiraling out of control.
Around the time of Senegal's legislative elections in July, several people were arrested for publishing parody versions of daily newspapers. Officially, they were being detained on charges of spreading fake news, but government critics calling for their release say that their right to freedom of speech has been infringed. Sam Brad-Peace reports.
Supporters of Papito Kara and Ousmane Diagne say they have been wrongfully imprisoned. It has been nearly 3 months since they were arrested for sharing parody versions of the country's leading newspapers online. Campaigners are also calling for the release of 15 others who they describe as political prisoners denied freedom of expression.
It's very shocking. To arrest people just because they have published parody front pages is a massive injustice.
Freedom of expression exists in name only in Senegal. This is not acceptable in a country with rule of law.
The arrest came after legislative elections and have alarmed some of the country's most prominent human rights defenders.
Arresting people because they made fake front pages? It's unbelievable. These are opposition figures. Using derision to subvert power is what opposition figures do. They use irony, they use mockery. Frankly, their arrest is an attack on freedom of expression.
The Senegalese government projects itself as a leader on freedom of speech in Africa, but says it is cautious about the rise of fake news. Authorities insist that the arrests were justified.
Of course, there are individual freedoms that the state must respect, but there is also the need for respecting the honour of others. In a democracy with the rule of law, we can't tolerate insults on social media, whether it's defamation or the publication of fake news. The justice system cannot just stand by.
Protesters plan to launch further demonstrations in the coming weeks.
Well, South Africa is home to part of one of the largest scientific endeavours in history. The Square Kilometre Array, or SCAR, is the world's biggest telescope, and the international project aims to probe mind-boggling questions about the birth of our universe. SCAR is on the brink of broadening its horizons with dozens of new parabolic telescopes, as our team reports.
In the heart of the Karoo Desert, 64 telescopes are trained on deep space, mapping and measuring cosmic mysteries. An international council of top radio astronomers are eager to see triple the amounts of antennas here as part of the Square Kilometre Array Observatory.
A radio telescope is different from an optical telescope because it's not limited by the size of the lens, for instance. In this case, the instrument can look further than what an optical telescope can do, which has allowed astronomers to map, for instance, the clearest picture of the Milky Way than we've ever had before.
133 of these dishes will be added to the site to form a telescope spanning a 1 square kilometre array. This prototype took 3 years to fine-tune. It's the project's most valuable instrument. France has played a big part.
All these projects, anyway, no single country can build them. I mean, these are enormous projects, so you have to team up with several countries, and each country brings what it can do.
South Africans built and operated the first phase of installation, the Meerkat, independently. It was so successful that the country won the bid to host the rest of the international mid-frequency array. 70% of work on this SKA site is done by specially trained local people. At a recent meeting in Cape Town, council members were impressed by the host country's progress.
They had their little 26-meter telescope in 2006 and started Meerkat. Today it's the best radio telescope in the world. And of course, while doing this, with the help of the government, every year there are 100 young people who receive scholarships to work on SCAR.
The world's largest telescope project was initiated 30 years ago, and it will only take another 8 to complete.
And finally, a lot of Nigerian fans of the UK's Duchess of Sussex have been expressing their excitement after she said that a genealogy test that she'd taken a couple of years back had revealed her to be 43% Nigerian. Meghan Markle gave an insight into her possible roots during her podcast Archetypes. Some of her followers have even gone as far as suggesting local names for her, many of which, though sounding pretty lovely, probably won't be taken up as she has enough monikers and titles to contend with already, in my opinion, anyway. Well, that is it, though, for Eye on Africa. Thanks very much for joining us. Do so again if you can. Till then, take care.
Cuando vas a la playa, piensa en la arena,